Thank you for joining us again for another episode of the Interfaiths podcast here at FIU, working on trying to build interfaith dialogue and respect for all religious traditions, including those with no religious traditions, and creating a pluralistic world. So we're very honored to have Professor Jeanette Smith, who is an institution in the South Florida community, has done tremendous work in terms of social justice, especially advocating for workers' rights, interfaith dialogue, and particularly all forms of social justice and trying to make the world a better place. She's had lots of setbacks and challenges. Unfortunately, I think we're going through one of those periods right now. But she is an inspiration. She always comes to the classroom, to meetings, in a very positive spirit, always has something positive to say, and is hopeful. She's a community builder, someone who gathers all types of interest and people together towards a vision of a better future, a vision of a more just sort of society, and really pours her heart, her time, her energy, into people who are perfectly strangers, honestly, and trying to make the world a better place by touching people's lives. So she's done a tremendous amount of good, and she's kind of one of our moral exemplars here in South Florida, and we're very, very happy and honored to have her. And she represents the Quaker community. So she's going to talk a little bit about her personal background, where she grew up, and kind of some of the formative experiences that she had in terms of kind of what has made her this sort of person who is really has a strong character and has a strong moral foundation and vision for her life in terms of social justice, and then talking a little bit about her journey towards Quakerism as well. And then we'll continue the conversation from there. So welcome, Janette.
Thank you. I don't even know how to go after that. That was a lot. It's very nice to be here. I think this is very cool that you're doing these series. This is nice. So where do you want me to start? Just a little bit about...
Yeah, where did you grow up?
Small town. In northern Maryland, there were two streets, Main Street and Church Street. You had the church, Main Street had everything else. Okay. We really did get our mail in there was like a little general store. That's where we got our mail. So definitely grew up out in the country, great place actually in a lot of ways to grow up. Playing, running, climbing trees. And at that time, I'm sure it's changed a lot since I grew up, but not a whole lot of people went away even to college where I grew up, and my high school took several different towns to fill up one high school, and it was probably the size of one class at Palmetto now or something. Wow, right. Yeah. So it was small, but I was also one of those kids that wanted to see the whole world. And there was a show, The Big Blue Marble, and at the end of it, you could write a letter if you wanted a pen pal. And so I had like pen pals all over the world. And in fact, my first one, the next biggest town next to us was from Manchester, Jamaica. Okay. Because my teacher came in one day with letters and said from different Manchesters around the world, and said, "Who wants a pen pal?" And up my hand went. Wow, so cool. My very first pen pal was from Manchester, Jamaica. And I later got to meet her when I studied in Jamaica. Wow. Like years later. That's amazing. In law school. Yeah. So it could have gone a different way if I didn't have the interest that I had. Right. Which is kind of why I ended up at Florida International University as well.
What about your parents in terms of how did they help to shape you?
Well, my parents actually divorced when I was rather young. I was born in Pittsburgh, and I grew up, I moved to the Azores because my dad was in the military. He was in the Air Force. And my brother was born there. For years, we've had to constantly explain to people, no, he is a citizen. He is a citizen. But we came back to the U.S. probably when I was about 3.5. And my mom was actually she was married another 3.5 years after that. This is the not so nice part of the story. My stepfather was a rather violent person. And I admire my mom for having the courage in a small town to leave that type of situation, because a lot of people wouldn't. Because, now you're divorced twice, you might as well be wearing a scarlet letter, right? But she had the courage to leave it and to then work 3 jobs taking care of my brother and I. So I think that I really, my grandmother had been a school teacher, 4th grade school teacher. And the school where I went when I was little, she was a teacher there. And so I think a lot of my influences are from her, because my mom was so busy working just to take care of us. you know. And then my uncle was a reader, and he said, you take a book everywhere you go because you never know when you'll have a chance to read. Right. So a lot of things came from him. Yeah. So I started carrying books everywhere I went. So I think between my grandmother, you know, between my uncle, I was just, you know, this idea that you just read. And I think that's probably what exposed me to the idea that there was this much bigger world out there that I wanted to see. And in fact, though, here's an interesting thing, because you mentioned about the being Quaker. I was not raised Quaker. I was actually baptized Catholic because my father was Catholic. My mom was Lutheran. In marriages where one party is Catholic, the other is not, the rule is that you baptize Catholic. Right. My aunt always said it was a plot to take over the world, marriage by marriage, child by child. But because I didn't grow up with my dad, you know, and then my mom was just working all the time. And even my stepfather, when she got married, was Lutheran, and he made the silly excuse, oh, we can't go to church because they're Catholic and we're little kids. You could have taken us anywhere, right? And so I really just didn't grow up going to church at all. Okay. But like I said, spent so much time with my grandmother, who was half Native American. So I think a lot of the ideas and the way I saw things were that influence from her. Right. And it was actually when I'd gone to Singapore to study. Okay. And my two women I was closest to while I was there, I was studying and working in a law firm, were an attorney who was Sikh, and then another woman who was Malay, who was Muslim. And those were the two women I was closest to while I was there. And when I came back from Singapore, which is an extraordinary place because the diversity, you know, of religions, of people, of cultures, of languages. And when I came back, I really realized that, you know, it didn't matter. Like, I may believe what I believe, but I don't disbelieve what others believe. Right. Like, I was okay with that. I was very comfortable with that. And that I, you know, something, because, you know, the things we're told when we're little, the sky is blue. Okay, it's blue. And we just kind of accept these without necessarily questioning them. So I came back with, you know, it mattered that I believed what I believed, but it was okay. I didn't disbelieve other things. Right. And I came back with that idea. And that is actually when I actually went through confirmation. So let's not tell the Archbishop this. I went through confirmation into the church, did an adult confirmation. They kept putting me in the group with the nun. So these are adult confirmations. And interestingly, in this group, because at this point I had law degree, the deacon was an attorney. There was an attorney that was in a mixed marriage that was converting. So there was a different kind of group that thinking, analyzing. Exactly. It's not your average conversion group. Right. And they kept putting me in the group with the nun. And I thought that was so funny. And she said one time, this was a little bit, you know, pre-Vatican II. She thought that, you know, if you weren't Catholic, you went to hell. And I'm like, but wait. And I had this example of a goat herd in Nepal. This was really important to me, this goat herd. Okay. Because I was like, he's a good goat herd. Right. And he takes care of the goats. He takes care, you know, he's a good person in his village. He's a good husband, good father, good son. Right. This person's going to hell because they're not Catholic. Right. I don't get it. Right. And then she finally said, okay, well, he wasn't. Goat herd was okay. But if you left the Catholic Church, that's where you would go to hell. Interesting. I was like, alrighty. Anyway, so I go through the process. Okay. I have my confirmation. It was a moment. I definitely felt the spirit. It was an Easter Vigil confirmation. You know, in fact, my confirmation godmother was the dean of students from UM Law. She's passed away now because I've become very close to her over time. And it was a moment. It was definitely a moment for me. But I was constantly, like, I had learned things and read things when I was in Asia. And I was thinking about Basil Wetherington, and there had been 2 Catholic priests who had been in India and had been threatened with excommunication because they talked about, like, meditation. Right, exactly. Yeah. But nowadays, seminaries have centering prayer all and things like this. This is not, it's not seen as, you know, heretical as it once was. So I was constantly thinking, continuing. And I then started to work for American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker-based organization. It's global. And I was the Florida director, moved into shortly thereafter the regional director for the Southeast. And, you know, I remember, though, when I went to fill in my application, after you turn in your resume, if they're interested in you, you fill out an application. And because they're faith-based, they can ask you questions about your faith that you normally couldn't. And you read a little bit about Quakers, and I start to answer questions. And as I'm writing my answers, it's like short essays, I start to cry because I know this is what I am.
Wow.
This is without even a question in my mind. I could feel it. And I don't say anything. I apply. Okay, day comes for the interviews. Quakers, we interview by committee.
Okay,
sure. We do everything by committee. So you've got the committee of staff, the committee of like regional directors and things. And I was the last person interviewed that day. And in fact, the regional director at the time had been sure they were going to have to start again. They weren't going to find anybody. And then I came in and we talked, and I didn't really talk about my faith in particular. We talked about how I saw social justice issues, immigration, different issues. I had a diverse background. I'd studied in Jamaica, studied in Singapore, Mexico, Italy. And so we were talking, and she assumed I was Quaker during the interview. It never dawned on her I wasn't. Right. And she was so like excited about me that she was like making my to-do list already while I'm being interviewed. Right. And it was just it's an interesting thing because things that I believe that people don't convert to something. Right. I think you discover what you are. I've always believed that. Right. So to me, that's what I always was. I just, and it was interesting because when I talked to my mom about it, my aunt, they said, considering where we live, Northern Maryland, that proximity to Pennsylvania, some of the ideas, and all the time you spent with my grandmother. Yeah, right. And some of those ideas, and I think of Quakerism as like, it's more of like a natural faith. Right, exactly. And there's ideas about mysticism and things. And to me, that fit a lot of the beliefs that like my grandmother grew up with and things. So it was just who I am. Yeah. I think it also explained too why when I was practicing law and working with a lot of reggae artists, and I worked with a lot of Rastafari, and they always used to say, yeah, Rasta, you not know it. I'm like, no, I'm not. But it was because I was able, again, another natural faith, because I was able to speak in a way that they related to, but they also spoke in a way I related to. Right. So I don't think I became Quaker. I think I always was Quaker. I discovered that I was Quaker and haven't left the path since.
Oh, that's amazing.
So you now know more than a lot of people do about my journey.
No, I mean, it's quite a remarkable journey. I mean, I know that there was a lot of depth there. Yeah. Because it's something that you do. I think, from my perspective, you really live the values that I've seen among the Quakers, and particularly I was more exposed to American Friends Service Committee and kind of some of the work that they do, particularly after, and this is kind of also some of the work that I do with the Jewish community, but especially after 9/11. So there were some of the few organizations that really stepped up and said, we're going to support Muslims, because at that point, people were like, we don't want to deal with Muslims. They're all terrorists. They're horrible people. Right. And that was like a mainstream line across the United States, and particularly sort of in conservative circles, and it was just remarkable to see people like the Quakers that like stood up and they're like, no, we're not going to be against hate. A lot of the liberal Jewish groups also, stood up for Muslim rights. The Japanese Americans also stood up. So, so I'm very indebted, and I have a lot of admiration for the Quakers. And I think that, and especially the other thing that I think is really remarkable that I think American Muslims can learn a lot from is just the way that Quakers are very much embedded within American culture and society, and yet they can take very heterodox perspectives and create moral authority around it. And I think like one of the things that I'm really found remarkable is pacifism. Right. I think that is such a powerful moral virtue. Right. That's really not mainstream. It's not something that people really agree with, but at the same time, like the way that Quakers own it is a way that they're able to really help direct they have moral authority in America based on things like that,
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I remember one time somebody wrote me a letter, somebody from like Kentucky or something. He saw an article where I'd been interviewed, and he said, oh, it's admirable, pacifist. He goes, but that's the easy route. And I thought, wow, then you really don't know what it is. I mean, it was a really respectful response I had, but
Yeah,
I thought, you really don't know how
yeah.
difficult it can be. I remember my younger cousin, he's probably about 15 years younger. And he, at one point when he was like in college, said, no, she speaks out too much to be a pacifist. I'm like, whoa, you don't know what.
Exactly.
And it was really interesting how people have like an idea
Yes,
in their
exactly.
mind as to what pacifism means. And I also recognize that to be pacifist in some countries
Yeah.
is far easier than in other
Right.
countries. I get that. But at the same time, it's not necessarily an easy route. And you can talk about it, but what would you do in the moment?
Right.
And I have this talk sometimes with my students in like intro to religion. Sometimes we talk about different things. And I'm not shy about sharing my background with them, because I hope, if nothing else, they come out of my classes recognizing that we all have our own biases,
Right.
the way we were raised, culturally, religious, whatever it is, right? That's all intertwined. But other people have other beliefs, and that's okay
Right,
too.
exactly.
But I said, I don't think I'm fair to you if I'm asking you to recognize your biases if I don't share mine.
Right.
And I always will explain, and they're always very interested, because a lot of times professors don't tell them, but I feel like I'm telling them as part of like a moment.
Exactly.
And I said, so it's important for me to be able to, and I tell them one of the advantages of the work I do, both in the community and the classroom, is that because I do believe everybody's path is equally valid. I'm not imposing that on anybody, but I'm also coming from a certain perspective. And I sometimes tell them, I said, I wonder about those moments, if my mother were in danger, how would I respond? There's a lot of things I try to talk my way out of first.
Yeah.
But what would I do? It's my mom.
Exactly.
Like, we think we know.
Right.
And I had an interesting situation last year with a student who has now been expelled, who was rather violent.
Right.
And very aggressive in my interreligious dialogue class, actually, and was up and, was kind of challenging with the other students, and then came up and finger in my face and, what do you think about that? And he went to sit down. And this is probably just being me, but also being me as a Quaker. Yeah. I said, well, it strikes me as a bit aggressive. Yeah. And it struck him, how did she stay so calm? Like, I didn't, plus, let's be frank, I've also learned you can't show fear to the bully. Yeah. You don't. It's worse. So, and I said, it strikes me as rather aggressive. And he got so angry, he stormed out of the room. Yay. After that, they put, we had plainclothes detectives outside 2 of my classes for the rest of the semester. But a couple of the students were really surprised, especially the young women, like, how did you stay so calm? Even a couple of the guys were like, that's probably already embedded within me. So maybe that was one of those moments where you sort of see. Yeah. But at the same time, as things progressed with him and there was a lot of negative communication, threats, I remember somebody was suggesting to me from the FIU police and things like I should carry mace or something like that, just in case. And I had to sit there and think about that. And I went online, I looked for Quaker groups, and there was one woman who bought mace at a suggestion and never took it out of the package. And I was like, I couldn't find it in me. I understood that people were saying it would be defensive, but it would still be violent. And I really had to think about, how do I keep myself safe in a way that's nonviolent, So I had to think a lot about timing, where I went, what I did. And I'm sure he's moved on to bothering someone else now. Not a good thing. But that was a bit of a test. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That was a bit of a test, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that there's these real life situations. I mean, one of the things I also like about the department also is that we've been able to connect with the Jain community. Yes, I love that. And that's been so much to learn from, I think, in terms of their own tradition of nonviolence and what that means. And there's this, the nonviolence of intention, of thought, of speech, and there are all these like philosophical dimensions to it. I think that's been a lot of fun to sort of learn through. We talk a lot about like positive peace, right? And it's more than just like the absence of tension; it's the presence of justice. Exactly. So that's another whole angle there. And it was funny. I, at one point, took the Sacred Sources class with a professor who used to be here, Steve Vos. And we got to write after the Jain lecture. And he was like so impressed with what I wrote. He says, you should look into doing the fellowship. You should this and that. You just understand. And I'm like, I just understand what it means to be Quaker.
Right.
and I feel like Jane sometimes put us to shame because they're whole next level.
Yeah.
But it was so fascinating that what he saw in me as an understanding of Jainism was actually where I was coming from already. Exactly. Yeah. I remember thinking that was funny.
No, I mean, I think a lot of this stuff is like, they're very deep eternal truths that these faith traditions are able to sort of understand and express. And so just finding those commonalities, I think is like extremely rewarding. And it's also really nice to see it reflected in other people and to have those conversations. I think especially in these troubling times, it's always wonderful to see other people that have similar values, you know. Yeah, absolutely.
But you know, it's interesting when you say that though, because there's people I feel, because I do, as you mentioned, a lot of interfaith work.
Right.
Have for years, American Friends Service Committee, South Florida Interfaith Worker Justice, Mosaic, previously MCCJ. I used to co-chair the clergy dialogue. One of the first times I'd ever had a non-clergy person, because my tradition doesn't have clergy. And you still get these truths across, like, you know, Judith, who's now kind of chairing us, right, as you know. I connect with her. Like, we've been on panels together, and we've been asked questions about different topics, and we always say afterwards, like, I totally agreed with what you said. I'm like, I totally agreed with what you said. But now she's coming from, like, you know, a Jewish tradition. Exactly. But it's like there's people I feel like I connect with, and it doesn't have anything to do with what their particular faith is. It's those underlying truths. Right. Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about your interfaith work, you know, like kind of what you've learned over the years in terms of doing this sort of work. Any sort of lessons learned?
That's interesting. I think one of the most important things, well, first of all, I think it goes to the underlying truths. Like when we talk about things, like I've done a lot around workers' rights, you know, low-wage workers in particular, immigration-related issues, that there are a lot of underlying truths that are the same across traditions. You know, I often say to my students, I don't know a tradition, and there may be one, but I don't know one that says, go steal from your workers.
Right, exactly.
That's not something that's taught. And so I think there's a lot of similarities in that regard. I also think that it's important to know, when I was a little girl, I had this idea that there was God, and everybody just called God different things, right? And it's a lot more complex than that. But when I was a little girl in Maryland, in my two-street town, that's what I thought, right? And I think that it's important to know that you're not necessarily going to agree on everything. That's okay. And even people in general, if you're looking at social justice types of topics, are not going to have the same ideas. So what are the things that you can meet on? Where are the things that you're in the same place on? And that you can work on these issues because you're in that same place.
Exactly.
Because I think sometimes people think it's going to be across the board.
Everything,
and it's not. And I've been involved with numerous like interfaith services. And sometimes a complaint, not of those services, but of other events I've seen in the community that have been interfaith, has been people have felt like their beliefs got watered down so that nobody was saying something the other people didn't agree with.
That's right.
That's a danger. That's a danger. The interfaith services I've been involved with have fortunately not been that. We all were part of it. There may have been an overarching theme, but we were all part speaking from our traditions. So I think that's really important because if you're looking for everybody to agree, you're going to water it down to something somewhat meaningless.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'd say that's important. And I think sometimes people who aren't accustomed to doing that work don't realize that. Like we're okay with not agreeing on everything. It's perfectly fine.
Exactly.
And in fact, that's why I've really enjoy being involved with like clergy dialogue, for example, where we would have sometimes theological topics. And I always get invited when it's to speak from a certain perspective when it's the workers, you know, but you'll have like a Jewish perspective, a Muslim perspective, you know, a Christian perspective, which I feel let's go broader. You just say Christian. I don't know what that means. I'll tell you a little secret too. People don't always realize this. I know that Quakers are considered to be one of the Protestant sects, not usually if you ask Quakers. So some Quakers will tell you they are Christian. Other Quakers will tell you that they're not. And I remember I was dating a guy for several years and something came up and I said, but I'm not Christian. And he says, yeah, but you're Quaker. I said, yes. So you're Christian? No. He's like, wait. I had to stop our whole relationship for a minute and say, wait, explain this to me. Because it's not, once upon a time when the religion was first founded, it was considered a separate branch of Christianity, outside Protestants, outside Catholics. Right. But I think it's come to the place because so much of what we do is that idea of the Spirit or that of God within everyone and that light within and that reflective piece, that there are folks who are more Christocentric, but there are others who are not. And it doesn't make us any less Quaker. Right. So, for example, the meeting here, the Miami Friends meeting, tends to, in my mind, be more tradition, where it's interesting because we're probably progressive in our social ideas, but traditional in our practice. And so you may not necessarily identify with being Christian when you're Quaker. I would never even propose to speak for all Quakers. Right. Yeah.
No, I've seen that, I think, with some of the other, like, more universal traditions within Christianity. So I was saying, like, I work with the Unity Church and some of the other groups. You'll see that within these movements as well.
Yeah. Right. So a lot of people don't realize that. Exactly. An assumption is made. Right. It's like, maybe true, may not be true. It depends on the Quaker you're speaking to.
That's right, exactly. That's right, yeah.
So, with South Florida Interfaith Worker Justice, I worked with a lot of clergy and had to gather clergy. A habit I had for anyone who wants to organize faith community, I always would go to someone's services first. I wanted to go to their house of worship. I wanted to get familiar with what was important to them.
Right.
What's in their bulletin? What do they talk about? What's on, then I would approach, because I really was looking, it could be like, I knew what we were working on, and I knew that it was shared amongst many traditions around worker justice, but I also needed to know, like, what mattered to them. What were the issues of importance to them? I love that. I
think that's great. Yeah.
It makes a big difference.
It makes, yeah.
Because sometimes, and also when you're asking clergy to get involved, you have clergy that are from houses of worship that have, multiple clergy, the senior, the junior, the this, the that. But then you have others, it's one person who's trying to do everything, and their community has issues, and someone just got evicted, and this is happening, and that is happening. So you really need to find, where's that connection? What am I doing that speaks to what you all care about and are already doing?
Yeah.
How can we work together? And it may be different. I used to kind of joke that sometimes there were the worker churches and the employer churches.
Interesting.
So the employer church is a little more interested in how it fits their scripture, et cetera, et cetera. The worker church is like, can you come in and do some worker rights trainings about wage stuff? Can you talk to us about that? And they can tell us where it is in the Bible.
Can you help us with the food pantry?
Can you help us with the food pantry? Exactly. Where are you? Yeah. And so I feel like it's important to know where somebody's coming from. And these could be the same tradition, faith tradition, but they have different areas of concern at the moment. One thing I find fascinating, which I love with the Muslim community, it's changing a little because there are a lot more mosques than there used to be.
Yeah.
But one of the areas that's often socioeconomically separated with certain traditions are the faith community, because it's the neighborhood where you live. Correct. But because there's less mosques, there's more diversity.
Exactly correct.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. That's one of the things I've always appreciated.
Yeah. I mean, there's especially to the mosque that I go to is the one, the Masjid al-Ansar, the first mosque in Florida, over there in Liberty City. And like when you go for Friday prayers, like 200, 300 people, and like neurosurgeons down to like people who work in construction and like from all over the world, from Morocco to Africa, like anywhere in the world, right? So it's quite remarkable, just the diversity of people.
And I love that. And that's not what happens in a lot. It tends to happen more if it is a community which has fewer houses of worship, because then people all come together from different areas.
Yeah. No, it's quite remarkable. What have you seen that has tanked interfaith projects? So things that made them not work out or to kind of fizzle out.
Schedules.
Okay.
Because you're asking generally people who are already very busy. And so who you're going to have that gets involved is going to be somewhat dependent. People who are retired may have more time than, say, other people may have. If you're talking about clergy, I often dealt directly with clergy and with their social justice committees and things in different houses of worship. And so schedule was a big thing. Also, I really have seen, not as much with the interfaith community, but I have seen situations where people really weren't respectful enough of the other faiths. Not so much when it's all interfaith. That's pretty good. Yeah. It's when you're also maybe dealing with some community groups and there's an overlap. I've had my own experiences when it's called South Florida Interfaith Work and Justice. You're going to be in meetings with all kinds of people.
Right, sure.
The Miami Worker Center, all kinds of different folks. And I remember the disparaging comments that would be made of faith communities sometimes. And I would be like, sitting right here in front of you, drafted that wage theft ordinance you're using, right? And sometimes there were folks, if you were working on something that might be seen as a little more progressive, there were folks that saw faith community as the enemy or the one holding things back or sheep. If we can just go in, they'll just listen to us and they'll do this thing. I found it interesting one time when I had a breakfast that I had hosted, an interfaith breakfast near Labor Day, and there were clergy and there were also some folks from unions and other groups. And I remember a woman that was with one of the unions with Jackson Memorial Hospital, and there were some challenges going on in the workplace. And she was very annoyed because they had had an event and no clergy had come to their event. And my first question was, did you invite us? And sometimes there's an assumption that if you have this moral right and this action that you're taking, that automatically faith community will step up there and be with you. Well, like any other groups, you have to have a relationship, know who we are. And also, if you just want to use the presence as opposed to actually having a conversation. So I've been in situations where they've taken a position and I've been like, I can't take that position. I agree with underlying what you're trying to do, but that particular wording, that's not going to appeal to me and to certain faith leaders that I know. Because oftentimes I was being asked to reach out to other faith leaders. So that was not faith working with faith. That's usually when someone outside is trying to figure out how to work with the faith community. That's more where I see the problems. It's not so much, I think when you have people that deliberately want to work together in an interfaith setting, they're there because they already have an openness to the fact that other people. Now, that being said, some folks are not as open to less mainstream faiths. Even within those settings.
That's a very good point as well.
I've heard those comments. I won't quote, but I know a particular rabbi who said something. I'm like, that's not helpful. Now he said it privately to me. But so I think sometimes, like some interfaith communities might not be as open to. UU church is usually okay, but not with everybody. And I remember years ago when we were trying to do the mission statement for South Florida IWJ, and this is before I was the executive director, I was just on the board. And I remember a clergy person from a congregational church that said, well, we should put this, and there was something about God in there, and then everybody will agree with this. And I said, not Unitarians. And our Unitarian minister board member wasn't there that day, so I felt like I should mention that. And so I think sometimes there's even an assumption about faith, that we all think the same and maybe not. And of course, when you start to go into like Wicca and everything, then that's a whole other conversation with, maybe not as much openness. I will say one thing though, the interfaith clergy, faith leaders, and I always tend to also say faith leaders for those of us who don't have clergy in our tradition, really are open to other traditions. Like, for example, they would like to see like more engagement with non-Abrahamic traditions. And they think that that's unfortunate that we're not having more.
Of course,
So I think that there's those folks want to have that and are open to that. Like I said, more of the issues have been when it's come from people that want to figure out how to work with the faith community on their issue. And there's like a little bit of a lack of understanding.
All right. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I want you to kind of, what would your message be to young people that are interested in doing interfaith work? What would you like to tell them?
I think it's funny. I should have this answer right away because I say things to my students all the time, even in the interreligious dialogue class. One thing we talk about in my class as well, is that you had said in the very beginning about how the diversity here, and there's also people that don't have a faith tradition. And we talk about that as well. And like, what are the underlying values? What are the things that matter to you? So it's not the exact same conversation depending who the young person is that you're speaking to. Because there are folks in my classes, for example, you'll know they have a faith tradition. It'll come up. And then there's other folks that don't, but we'll talk about like what it means to be agnostic or what it means to be atheist, or even we'll always do the question, can an atheist be moral? And of course they can, but we have that conversation about sometimes people have these ideas and people go to their faith tradition for different reasons. Some folks in my classes and my students will say they see it as a guideline, a moral guideline. And others, it's a comfort to them. We have all these different conversations. Exactly. But I think if anyone, you don't go into interfaith work because you want to spread your faith. That's not what interfaith work is.
It's not proselytization.
Yeah, that's not what that is. And that's a conversation we have too. But if you are just truly interested on working on things that matter to you in your community, and you would like to help change in your community, I think it's a great way to do that type of work and engage with, and you'll be surprised how many people actually share some of your same ideas, even though they may have had different backgrounds, been raised differently. But I think it's a fantastic way to kind of live your faith. And even if you are a person not of a traditional faith tradition, I think it's a great way to live your values.
Right.
So the thing about Quakers is that we don't say, people say we practice what we preach. Well, we don't preach. We practice what we practice, right? Because we don't have clergy and such. And so I often think, and I don't want to get too long for you, but I often think our worship, for those who don't know, is like silent worship, and you listen for the Spirit. And I sometimes have to, and if you feel you have a message, you stand, you share, you sit back down. No one's supposed to respond to you directly because it's not a conversation. They can reflect on it. I sometimes don't know if I should stand or not stand because my mind moves 1,000 miles a minute, and I'm always thinking about justice type things because it's how my mind works. And I sometimes think, is that a message or isn't it? But I'm already primed to those types of messages because of my beliefs. So it may well be a message, but it's like a little bit of a determination there. But I think if you feel moved to make a difference in your community, I think through interfaith work is a fantastic way to do it. And even if you don't, I don't want anyone who doesn't have a formal tradition to feel they can't do that. Because I've had a lot of young people who are just trying to live out their values. And this is a way that it helps them do that because of things that they care about in their community. I don't know if that exactly.
I love that. That's perfect. No, I think it's very, very good. Yeah. I think it's important for young people also, who are trying to come up in a very
turbulent
world. Yeah. And one that, it's existing, there's so much messaging and on so many different sort of platforms and in a very distracted sort of way. To think about something that you can do, that you can, really reflect upon in terms of like, what are your values and how do you move through the world and how do you impact other people's lives? And I think for me, the interfaith work, I think is a really good way for them to be able to explore this part of who they are.
I agree.
Well, thank you so much, Jeanette. I really appreciate it. This is really wonderful. Thank you for coming. Yeah, this is a great conversation. Definitely, we'll have you on for season 2 as well.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much.
Thanks
I could say a lot more, but we don't have more time.
Yeah.